The relationship between watches and motorsport is something that's lasted for essentially since it was invented. The idea, the notion that you need to time events when you're racing, it's one of the most relevant uses of a timing instrument in practical life that's still used today. So today we're going to take a look at a few racing chronographs, but let's start out with what is best known as probably the origin of the modern racing chronograph, and that is with the TAG Heuer Carrera. Now Heuer and TAG Heuer, as it's presently known, have been associated with motorsport ever since the 1960s. Jack Heuer, with his relationship with F1 driver Joe Siffert, was using motorsport as a vehicle to sell his watches. And Joe Siffert was actually selling watches on the pit lane, and one of those was of course the famed Carrera. Right here we have a limited edition that pays homage to the original 1960s Carrera, the reference 2447. This particular one of 600 pieces with the red dial, introduced in 2022. But here we can see a lot of cues of what the original racing chronograph was. You have the nice sharp Carrera lugs, you have the pump pushers, you have the vintage style Heuer branding. This is a great example of a modern interpretation of what the original racing chronographs would have been. And that relationship between Heuer and motorsport carries on till this very day. Through the years of success with Ferrari, McLaren, and now Red Bull, Heuer and TAG Heuer are still very closely associated with motorsport, specifically Formula One. But we have a few other watches that show a little bit more what a more modern racing chronograph are. They were all released anywhere from 1999 up until 2004. And this was a key moment because this is when motorsport was at its peak with the Michael Schumacher era in Formula One, as well as seeing a lot of technological advancement in terms of supercars. You think of cars like the Lamborghini Murcielago, like the Ferrari 360 Modena, all were showing a shift in terms of how cars were designed, presented. It was all much more modern. So we'll start out with one of the most accessible of these watches, and that is the Sinn 303. When you look at the dial right away, you can see the influence from motorsport and from cars. The dial itself evokes those VDO gauges from the 90s that you saw on Mercedes-AMG models. With little strikes of this orangish red, it looks like it's a speedometer or a rev counter. We also have other shocks of red on the tachymeter here. The watch itself of course includes a chronograph, this one based on the Baoshu 7750. This watch was actually rendered in several special editions, collaborating with Corvette, with Mazda, and with Mercedes-Benz as well. And it's not just a racing chronograph, it's also a strong all-rounder with 200 meters of water resistance, automatic winding, a day and a date in this example, and even later versions of it were anti-magnetic. However, if we're talking 2000s racing chronographs, we do need to recognize the chronographs that were found on the wrist of world champion Michael Schumacher. And those were of course Omega Speedmasters. Despite the fact that the Speedmaster is often more associated with the moon watch and the moon landing, it's important to remember that this watch originated and was supposed to be a racing watch. And one of the best examples is this carbon-dialed Omega Speedmaster Racing. This really exemplifies the time period. It was released in 2003 at a time when carbon fiber was making its way into the mainstream when you talk about car design and car construction. So on the face of it, you have this older style carbon weave, which is what you would have seen on early supercars from the early 2000s. You've also got these shocks of red, which pay a little bit of a link to the Michael Schumacher connection of the time. It's important to remember he actually had his own line of Speedmaster Racing, equipped with a Frederic PA-based Omega Caliber 3301. It was automatic, unlike the manual wind Moonwatch, and featured a vertical clutch and column wheel chronograph, so you could measure your lap times, all while staring at that amazing, for that time, very technologically advanced carbon fiber dial. And last but not least, we can't really talk about racing chronographs without mentioning the one that's named after a track, and that is of course the famous Rolex Daytona. When we talk about the Daytona today, everyone's mind jumps to the steel models. But the thing is that when it comes to the Daytona, the steel models are only just plain black and white dials. Rolex puts the most fun into its precious metals, specifically the white gold Daytonas. That's where you see, for example, the meteorite dials and this right here, which is the racing dial. The racing dial Daytonas were introduced on the white gold variants again in 2004, so all of these from roughly the same period. And this really leaned into Rolex's involvement in motorsport. To this day, they are the prime sponsor of Formula One. They still sponsor the 24 Hours at Daytona and give a Daytona as the prize for the winner. So here we have an example of the racing dial. And one of the big things that really jumps out is the use of Arabic numerals instead of regular indices. This gives it a very distinctive look when compared to the Roman numerals or the standard indices that we're used to seeing. Again, you have shocks of red. It's important to remember that these three watches were all released around the time that Ferrari was dominating Formula One. So the use of red is very, very important. And admittedly, the use of red has always been associated with motorsport, with racing, with speed. And that's why it's pervasive across all of these. Apart from that, it is still a modern Daytona. On the inside, you still have the caliber 4130, which was used until 2022. It's interesting though, at this point, it was still quite early. They had just replaced the zenith movement on the inside. And so this was a very, very futuristic movement for its time, and testament to that is the fact that it lasted for over 20 years. But the proportions are still classic Rolex Daytona. It's still the thinnest of all of these watches on the table. And when it comes to Rolex, it's not often that you get really these gems that offer amazing value as well. If you consider the current pre-owned prices for a steel Daytona, for a little bit more you can get this white gold piece, which has proper precious metal, which has much closer association to racing by virtue of how it's presented. It really leans into that concept much more than the standard steel Daytonas. The interesting thing though is that these designs specifically of chronographs have really held true. Both the original Carrera and these modern batches, they've really set the standard. The next level is perhaps Richard Mille, which also originally was released in 2001 with the original RM01. But beyond that, the racing chronograph was really defined in the modern era by watches like these. Watches that really leaned into the notion of modern racing for the 21st century. Luckily here at Chronext we have this full selection as well as tons of other chronographs available for purchase at all different price ranges. But let me know in the comments below which of these is your favorite and which style do you relate to more? Do you prefer the more vintage style of the TAG Heuer and of the original vintage racing chronographs? Or do you prefer the more modern take? Steel with a bracelet with a tachymeter bezel on the outside. I'd love to know you guys' opinions in the comments below. And of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more videos about watches, then make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell as well so you know when the next video comes out. In any case, thanks for joining us on this quick video about the evolution of the racing chronograph, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.